At Sunday dinner, Daniel Collins squeezed his mother's hand 3 times under the table, the same silent signal he had used as a boy when he needed his father's help. Margaret Collins froze for half a second, though her face remained calm and polite as she lifted her glass of iced tea. Anyone looking at the table would have seen nothing unusual, just a quiet family dinner in a comfortable suburban home outside Columbus, Ohio. The dining room smelled faintly of roasted chicken and rosemary potatoes, and soft jazz drifted from a speaker on the kitchen counter. Olivia Collins, Daniel's wife, was speaking cheerfully about a new renovation she wanted to start in the house, her voice bright and confident, the kind of voice that filled a room easily. Margaret nodded politely while she listened, but her attention had shifted entirely to the hand resting beside hers. Daniel's hand had always been warm when he was younger, always restless, always full of nervous energy. Tonight it felt tense and still, like someone holding their breath. She remembered the signal instantly. 3 squeezes. It had been something Daniel invented when he was 10 years old after a difficult year at school. His father had told him that if he ever felt stuck in a situation he couldn't explain out loud, he could squeeze his dad's hand 3 times, and it would mean one simple message: "Dad, help." Margaret hadn't thought about that signal in decades. Her husband had been gone for 5 years now, taken suddenly by a heart attack one quiet winter morning. Since then, the old signals of childhood had felt like artifacts from another life. But Daniel had just used it again. Margaret carefully set her fork down on her plate, keeping her movements slow and natural. Olivia was still talking, explaining something about refinancing the mortgage to fund the renovation, speaking with the smooth confidence of someone used to making decisions. Daniel sat beside her, nodding occasionally, though Margaret noticed he rarely spoke. That alone was unusual. Daniel had always been talkative, especially during Sunday dinners. For years, these dinners had been their family tradition. Margaret cooked, Daniel told stories from work, and laughter usually filled the small dining room. Tonight felt different. Daniel's shoulders were stiff. His eyes stayed mostly on his plate. And every time Olivia spoke, he gave a small, quick nod as if agreeing automatically. Margaret glanced toward him once, carefully. Their eyes met for only a moment before he looked away. It was enough. The same uneasy look she had seen years ago when he came home from school after a rough day. Quiet, guarded, asking for help without saying the words. Margaret folded her hands calmly in her lap, the picture of a polite mother enjoying dinner with her son and daughter-in-law. Inside, however, her mind had begun turning slowly, carefully, the way it always did when something didn't feel right. Daniel Collins had not used that signal in nearly 30 years. A man didn't return to a childhood signal unless something was very wrong. Margaret smiled gently across the table as Olivia continued talking about renovation budgets and property values, but the warmth in her smile hid a new awareness settling into her thoughts. Something was happening in this house. And whatever it was, her son had just asked for help. Margaret Collins did not mention the signal for the rest of the evening, but once she noticed it, she began to observe everything more carefully. Olivia continued speaking about the renovation plans as if nothing unusual had happened, describing paint colors, flooring options, and the possibility of expanding the kitchen by almost 200 square feet. Her tone carried the quiet authority of someone who had already made most of the decisions. Daniel nodded politely from time to time, though Margaret noticed that he rarely added anything of his own. When Olivia asked him if he agreed with the plan to refinance the mortgage, he hesitated for a moment before answering yes. It was a small pause, barely noticeable, but Margaret had raised him since he was born, and she could hear uncertainty even in a single breath. Margaret asked a few simple questions during dinner, keeping her voice light and curious the way any mother might. She asked Daniel how work had been lately and whether the company had finished the new project he mentioned a few weeks earlier. Before Daniel could answer, Olivia responded quickly that Daniel had been thinking about stepping back from work for a while because he had been under too much pressure. Margaret lifted her eyebrows slightly. Daniel had built his consulting business from the ground up over the past 12 years. It was something he spoke about with pride every time they met. The idea that he would suddenly step away from it sounded unusual. Daniel gave a small nod when Olivia finished speaking, but he did not look at his mother. Margaret continued eating quietly while the conversation moved to other subjects. The plates were cleared, and Olivia brought out a homemade apple pie that smelled warm and sweet. The evening looked completely normal on the surface. The dining room lights glowed softly above the table, and outside the window the quiet neighborhood street was lit by a row of yellow porch lights stretching down the block. Margaret smiled and complimented the pie, yet her attention remained fixed on the subtle changes she kept noticing. Daniel had always been relaxed during their weekly dinners, leaning back in his chair, telling stories, asking his mother questions about her week. Tonight his posture remained straight and careful, as if he was measuring every word before speaking. When Margaret asked him about an old friend from church, Daniel began answering, but stopped halfway through his sentence when Olivia casually corrected him about the date of an event he had mentioned. Daniel immediately apologized and repeated Olivia's version instead. It was a tiny exchange that would have seemed meaningless to most people, but to Margaret it felt like another piece of a puzzle slowly forming. After dessert, Daniel offered to walk his mother to her car. Olivia remained inside the house, saying she wanted to start loading the dishwasher. The evening air outside was cool and still, carrying the faint scent of freshly cut grass from a nearby yard. Margaret walked slowly down the short driveway with Daniel beside her. For a moment neither of them spoke. Margaret waited, giving him space the same way she had done when he was younger and needed time to gather his thoughts. Daniel reached for the passenger door of her car and opened it gently. Before Margaret stepped inside, he glanced back toward the house, checking the window as if making sure Olivia could not see them clearly. Then his hand found hers again. This time he squeezed once, softly, not the signal itself, but something that felt just as meaningful. His voice remained quiet when he spoke. He said that everything was fine and that he would call her later in the week. Margaret nodded as if she believed him, though she could see the worry behind his polite smile. When she drove away a few minutes later, the streetlights passed slowly across the windshield as she made her way toward the highway. Her hands rested steadily on the steering wheel, but her mind was far from calm. A childhood signal had returned after 30 years, and the look in her son's eyes told her that whatever was happening inside that house was not something he could explain openly. Margaret Collins had spent most of her life listening carefully to the things people did not say out loud, and tonight she felt certain about one thing. Her son had asked for help, and she intended to find out exactly why. Margaret Collins slept very little that night. The quiet house where she had lived for more than 30 years felt different as she moved through it the next morning, as if her thoughts had changed the atmosphere of every familiar room. Sunlight filtered through the kitchen window while she prepared her usual breakfast of oatmeal and coffee, yet her mind continued replaying the small details from the previous evening. The signal. Daniel's silence. Olivia answering questions that had not been directed to her. Margaret had always trusted her instincts about people. Raising a child alone for the past 5 years after her husband passed away had only sharpened that instinct. She knew when something in a family felt balanced and when it did not. After finishing her coffee, Margaret walked slowly into the living room and sat in the armchair beside the old bookshelf that still held decades of photo albums. One album in particular caught her attention. It was the one filled with pictures from Daniel's childhood. She opened it carefully and turned the pages one by one. There was Daniel at 6 years old holding a baseball glove that looked far too large for his small hands. Another photo showed him standing proudly beside his father in the backyard after building a wooden birdhouse together. Margaret paused on a picture taken when Daniel was about 10 years old, the same age he had been when he invented the signal. She remembered the afternoon clearly. Daniel had come home from school unusually quiet, and later that evening he explained that he sometimes felt uncomfortable asking for help in front of other children. His father had listened patiently and suggested they create a private signal. Something simple and discreet. 3 squeezes of the hand. A message that meant he needed support without drawing attention. That signal had worked more than once during Daniel's childhood. Sometimes it was something small like needing help in an awkward conversation with other adults. Other times it meant he felt overwhelmed in a situation he did not fully understand. The rule had always been simple. If Daniel used the signal, his father would quietly step in and guide the situation without embarrassing him. Margaret closed the photo album slowly and leaned back in her chair. Daniel had not needed that signal for nearly 3 decades. Seeing it return now meant that something in his life had made him feel the same quiet pressure he had once felt as a child. Later that afternoon, Margaret decided to make a short trip into town. She told herself it was simply to run a few errands, but she knew the real reason. Daniel's business office was located in a small brick building on Maple Street, only 15 minutes from her house. Margaret had visited it a few times over the years when Daniel proudly showed her how the company had grown. The parking lot looked quieter than usual when she arrived. Only a few cars were parked near the entrance. Margaret stepped inside and was greeted by the familiar smell of fresh coffee and printer ink. The receptionist behind the front desk recognized her immediately and smiled warmly. She said that Daniel had not been in the office much during the past few weeks because he had been handling most of his work from home. That information made Margaret pause for a moment. Daniel had always preferred working from the office where he could meet clients and coordinate with his small team. Margaret thanked the receptionist and said she had simply stopped by while running errands. As she walked back toward her car, the quiet street around the building seemed unusually still. She sat in the driver's seat for a moment before starting the engine, staring at the reflection of the afternoon sky across the windshield. The pieces were beginning to form a pattern that she could not ignore. Daniel was absent from the office he had built with so much effort. Olivia was making confident financial decisions about the house. And her son had returned to a signal he had not used since childhood. Margaret Collins did not yet know exactly what was happening, but she was certain of one thing. Daniel had reached out the only way he believed he safely could. And she had every intention of understanding why. Margaret Collins spent the next 2 days moving carefully through her routines while her mind quietly organized everything she had seen. She did not rush to conclusions because she understood something that many people forgot when emotions were involved. The truth revealed itself more clearly when patience guided the search. On Tuesday morning, she drove to the grocery store as usual, pushing her cart slowly through the aisles while greeting familiar faces from the neighborhood. The small routines of daily life helped her think. She remembered the way Daniel had looked during dinner, the hesitation in his voice, the quick glance he gave toward the kitchen window before speaking outside. That was not the behavior of a man simply tired from work. It was the behavior of someone measuring his words. Later that afternoon, Margaret sat at her kitchen table with a notepad in front of her, something she had learned from her late husband many years ago. When a situation felt complicated, he would write down what he knew for certain and what he did not yet understand. Margaret wrote 3 simple observations. First, Daniel had used the childhood signal that meant he needed help. Second, Daniel was no longer spending time at the office he had built with such pride. Third, Olivia appeared to be making important financial decisions without hesitation. None of these facts alone proved anything. Together they formed a pattern that could not be ignored. Margaret tapped the end of the pen gently against the paper while thinking. If Daniel had felt comfortable speaking openly, he would have done so when they walked to the car Sunday night. The fact that he had not meant there was a reason he could not speak freely inside that house. Margaret turned her attention to something else she had noticed. During dinner, Olivia mentioned refinancing the mortgage to fund renovations. The comment had sounded casual, but Margaret had lived long enough to understand how significant financial decisions rarely happened casually. Refinancing a home usually required careful planning, paperwork, and agreement from both homeowners. Yet Daniel had barely spoken during that conversation. That memory lingered in her thoughts long after. She finished writing on the notepad. By Wednesday morning, Margaret decided to take another small step. She placed a phone call to someone she trusted, a man who had worked closely with her husband for more than 20 years. His name was Lucas Bennett, an experienced attorney who still practiced downtown. Lucas had handled many legal matters for the Collins family over the years, including the estate documents after Margaret's husband passed away. When Lucas answered the phone, he sounded pleasantly surprised to hear from her. Margaret explained calmly that she had a few questions about financial agreements related to home refinancing and business ownership. She spoke carefully, not mentioning any suspicions directly. Lucas listened thoughtfully before suggesting they meet for coffee later that week, so he could explain a few things in person. Margaret thanked him and hung up the phone, feeling slightly more certain about the path she was taking. That evening she took a slow walk through her quiet neighborhood as the sun lowered behind the rows of maple trees lining the street. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalks and neighbors waved from their porches. Everything looked peaceful and ordinary, yet Margaret's thoughts remained focused on the quiet signal her son had used. Signals existed for a reason. They allowed someone to ask for help without speaking openly. As Margaret reached the corner of the block, she stopped for a moment and looked toward the fading orange sky. She had spent nearly 4 decades raising Daniel to be thoughtful, hardworking, and kind. She knew his character well enough to recognize when something in his life no longer felt right. Whatever was happening inside that house on Sunday evenings was not a simple misunderstanding. And if her son believed he needed help but could not ask for it directly, then Margaret Collins would continue watching, listening, and learning until the truth revealed itself. On Thursday afternoon, Margaret Collins met Lucas Bennett at a quiet coffee shop 2 blocks from the courthouse downtown. The place was small and familiar, with large front windows that looked out onto the sidewalk and a row of oak trees that lined the street. Lucas had already arrived and was seated at a corner table when Margaret stepped inside. He stood to greet her with the calm professionalism she remembered well, offering a warm handshake before they both sat down. Lucas had aged over the years, but his manner had not changed. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak it was with careful thought. Margaret ordered a simple cup of black coffee while Lucas chose tea. For a few minutes they talked about ordinary things. Lucas asked how she had been doing since the winter, and Margaret mentioned her garden and the tomatoes she had started growing behind the house again this year. The small talk created a comfortable pause before the conversation shifted naturally to the reason she had called. Margaret explained that she had been hearing discussions recently about refinancing a home and that she wanted to understand how such decisions usually worked when a married couple owned property together. Lucas nodded slowly and began explaining the process in clear terms. He said that refinancing normally required the consent and signatures of both owners if both names were on the title and mortgage. Lenders usually reviewed financial documents carefully before approving any changes. Margaret listened quietly, absorbing each detail. When Lucas finished explaining the basics, he added something that made Margaret pay closer attention. He mentioned that refinancing sometimes became complicated when other financial arrangements were connected to the property, especially if a business owner used the home as partial collateral for loans or investments. Margaret lifted her coffee cup but did not drink. She simply asked another question in a calm voice. She asked whether it was possible for one spouse to move money connected to a business account without the other fully understanding the implications. Lucas considered the question thoughtfully before answering. He explained that technically many business structures allowed different levels of financial control depending on how accounts and authority were organized. However, he also added that responsible partners usually kept each other fully informed because hidden financial changes often created serious problems later. Margaret nodded slowly. She did not accuse anyone or mention Daniel directly, but Lucas seemed to sense the deeper reason behind her questions. His expression softened slightly as he leaned forward across the table. He reminded Margaret that if someone felt uncertain about financial decisions involving family property or business assets, the best step was simply to gather clear information before making assumptions. Margaret thanked him sincerely for his time. Their conversation lasted nearly 40 minutes before they both stood and prepared to leave. Outside the coffee shop, the afternoon sunlight stretched across the sidewalk while traffic moved steadily along the street. Lucas shook her hand again and told her that she could call him anytime if she had additional questions. Margaret walked slowly toward her car parked along the curb. As she sat behind the steering wheel, she allowed herself a quiet moment of reflection. The conversation had confirmed something important. Major financial decisions rarely happened quietly without documentation and agreement. Yet, during Sunday dinner, Olivia had spoken about refinancing as though it were already decided. Margaret started the engine and pulled carefully into traffic, her thoughts moving with greater clarity now. She did not yet know the full truth about what was happening in Daniel's life, but she understood the next step clearly. If her son could not explain his situation openly, then she would continue asking the right questions until the answers appeared. The following Sunday arrived with the same quiet rhythm that had shaped the Collins family for years, yet Margaret Collins felt a subtle difference in the air even before she stepped through the front door of Daniel and Olivia's house. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the driveway, and the smell of something roasting drifted from the kitchen window. Margaret carried a small container of homemade cornbread, a habit she had maintained for decades, though tonight she noticed how carefully she observed every detail around her. Olivia greeted her with the same confident smile as always, welcoming her inside while explaining that dinner would be ready in a few minutes. The house looked tidy and modern, with new decorative pieces Margaret did not remember seeing before. A glass vase filled with fresh white flowers sat in the center of the dining table, and several new kitchen appliances gleamed under the overhead lights. Olivia spoke enthusiastically about how exciting it was to improve the house little by little, mentioning again that refinancing the property would make future upgrades easier. Margaret listened politely while removing her coat, her expression warm and relaxed. She had learned long ago that the best way to understand a situation was to let people speak freely. Daniel appeared from the hallway a moment later, offering his mother a gentle hug before helping carry dishes to the table. Margaret noticed immediately that his movements seemed careful again, almost rehearsed, as if he were playing a role he had practiced many times before. During dinner, Olivia talked about a new contractor who had visited earlier in the week to measure the kitchen walls. She described how removing a section of cabinetry could open the room by almost 3 feet, making the entire space feel brighter. Daniel nodded occasionally, but spoke only when directly asked a question. Margaret asked him about work again, keeping her tone light and friendly. This time Daniel answered briefly that he had been handling things from home while considering some adjustments to the business. Olivia quickly added that Daniel deserved a break after working so hard for so many years. The explanation sounded reasonable on the surface, yet Margaret sensed the same quiet tension beneath Daniel's polite smile. As the meal continued, Margaret observed another detail she had not noticed the week before. Several folders rested on a small desk near the living room doorway, partially visible from the dining table. The papers inside looked like official documents, neatly stacked with colored tabs marking different sections. Olivia mentioned casually that they had been organizing paperwork related to financial planning for the future. Margaret nodded while taking a sip of iced tea, though her attention lingered briefly on the folders. When dinner ended, Daniel offered to clear the plates while Olivia began loading the dishwasher. Margaret stepped into the living room for a moment, pretending to admire a framed photograph on the wall. From there she could see the desk more clearly. The folders were labeled with terms she recognized from her conversation with Lucas Bennett earlier in the week. Words such as mortgage review, property valuation, and loan adjustment were printed neatly across the tabs. Margaret did not touch anything. She simply observed the arrangement carefully before stepping back toward the kitchen. A few minutes later, Daniel joined her in the hallway carrying a stack of plates. Their eyes met briefly in the quiet space between rooms. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Daniel placed the dishes on the counter and wiped his hands with a towel. As Margaret turned slightly to leave the kitchen, his hand brushed lightly against hers again. The gesture lasted only a second, almost accidental to anyone watching, yet Margaret felt the unmistakable pattern return. 3 gentle squeezes. The signal from long ago, repeated with quiet urgency. Margaret did not react outwardly. She simply picked up her purse and thanked Olivia for the wonderful dinner, her voice calm and appreciative. When she stepped outside into the cool evening air, she paused for a moment beside her car, looking back at the softly lit windows of the house. Inside that peaceful home, something important was unfolding, and her son had now used the same silent message twice. Margaret Collins understood that patience would reveal the truth soon enough, and she intended to be ready when it did. Margaret Collins drove home slowly that night, the quiet hum of the engine filling the silence, while the streetlights passed in steady intervals across the windshield. The familiar roads of her neighborhood felt different now, not because anything around her had changed, but because her understanding of the situation was beginning to sharpen. Twice in 2 weeks, Daniel had used the signal he created as a child. A signal that meant he needed help but could not explain why. Margaret had learned something important during her years of raising a family and later managing a household alone after her husband passed away. People often revealed the truth in small ways long before they spoke about it openly. The way Daniel looked down during dinner. The way Olivia answered questions that were meant for him. The folders labeled with financial terms placed carefully on the desk. None of those details were dramatic on their own, yet together they formed a quiet pattern that Margaret could no longer dismiss as coincidence. When she reached her home, she turned off the engine and sat in the driveway for a moment, letting the calm night air settle her thoughts. She did not feel angry. She did not feel frightened. Instead, she felt something that had guided her through many difficult situations over the years. She felt focused. Inside the house, she placed her purse on the kitchen counter and turned on the small lamp beside the refrigerator. The warm yellow light filled the room while she poured herself a glass of water. Margaret then walked to the drawer where she kept the notepad she had started earlier in the week. She sat down at the table and added several new observations. Daniel had repeated the signal again. Important financial paperwork was clearly being organized in the house. And Olivia appeared to be leading most of those decisions while Daniel remained quiet. Margaret tapped the pen gently against the page, while thinking through what Lucas Bennett had explained during their meeting at the coffee shop. Major financial changes always left a trail of documentation. Mortgage reviews, loan adjustments, property valuations. Those were not casual conversations. They represented formal steps in a legal process. Margaret did not know the exact details yet, but she suspected something significant was happening behind those neatly organized folders. She also remembered something Lucas said that stayed with her long after their conversation ended. When financial decisions involved both family property and business interests, the situation could become complicated very quickly if one person controlled the information. Margaret leaned back slightly in her chair and closed her eyes for a moment. Daniel had always been a capable and intelligent man. If he was suddenly allowing someone else to manage decisions about his business and his home, there had to be a reason. Perhaps he felt pressure. Perhaps he believed he had no better option. Or perhaps he simply did not yet realize the full consequences of what was happening. Margaret opened her eyes again and looked down at the notepad. She wrote one final sentence beneath the others. Find the full picture before taking action. That simple line had guided many of the most important decisions in her life. Acting too quickly often created confusion, while careful observation revealed the truth in its own time. Margaret placed the pen down and stood from the table, turning off the lamp as she prepared to go upstairs for the night. Outside her window, the quiet neighborhood remained peaceful, with only the distant sound of a passing car moving along the road. Somewhere across town, Daniel Collins was likely preparing for another week filled with the same quiet tension Margaret had witnessed at the dinner table. But this time something was different. Margaret Collins was no longer simply watching from the outside. She was beginning to understand the structure of the situation, piece by piece, and once she saw the full picture clearly, she would know exactly how to help her son. The next morning, Margaret Collins woke earlier than usual, the pale light of dawn stretching across the quiet rooms of her home, while the coffee maker hummed softly on the kitchen counter. She had slept only a few hours, yet her mind felt unusually clear. Over the past week, she had gathered enough small pieces of information to recognize the outline of a much larger picture. The question was no longer whether something unusual was happening around Daniel. The real question was how deeply the situation affected his control over his own business and home. Margaret carried her coffee to the dining table and opened the notepad again. The short list she had written earlier in the week now felt incomplete. She added several new lines carefully, writing each thought in steady handwriting. Daniel absent from the office. Financial documents at the house. Olivia guiding major decisions. Signal repeated twice. When she finished writing, Margaret closed the notebook and sat quietly for a moment. She understood something important about Daniel that many people overlooked. Her son had always been responsible and loyal, sometimes to the point of placing other people's comfort ahead of his own concerns. That quality had made him a good husband and a respected business owner, but it could also make him vulnerable when someone else pushed decisions too quickly. Later that afternoon, Margaret drove again toward downtown. This time she was not visiting the coffee shop, but Lucas Bennett's law office located on the second floor of an old brick building near the courthouse square. Lucas welcomed her inside with the same calm professionalism he always showed, offering a seat in the conference room where sunlight filtered through tall windows overlooking the street below. Margaret explained that she wanted to understand something more specific about how property refinancing might interact with business ownership when both were connected to a family's finances. Lucas listened carefully before opening a folder on the table and sketching a simple explanation on a sheet of paper. He described how a home sometimes became part of the financial structure supporting a business loan. If someone refinanced the property, the terms of that structure could change significantly depending on who controlled the agreements. Margaret asked one more question after listening to his explanation. She asked whether it was possible for someone to begin organizing financial documents before the other partner fully understood the consequences. Lucas nodded slowly and said that it did happen sometimes, especially when one person handled most of the paperwork in the relationship. He emphasized that such decisions were safest when both partners clearly understood every step before signing anything. Margaret thanked him sincerely and stood to leave. As she walked down the stairs and stepped back onto the sidewalk, the afternoon breeze moved gently through the trees lining the street. She paused beside her car, thinking through everything Lucas had explained. The folders she saw in Daniel's house were not simply casual planning materials. They were part of a formal process that could lead to important legal commitments. Margaret drove home with steady focus, the traffic lights passing one by one along the road. When she reached her house, she went directly to the kitchen table and opened the notepad again. Beneath her earlier notes, she wrote another line in clear letters. Understand the documents before they are signed. Margaret Collins did not yet know exactly what Olivia intended to accomplish through those financial changes, but she knew one thing with certainty. Her son had reached for help without speaking aloud, and that meant the moment to understand the full situation was approaching quickly. The next Sunday dinner was only a few days away, and Margaret intended to arrive prepared to see far more than polite conversation across the table. Sunday arrived again with the quiet rhythm that had become familiar to Margaret Collins over the past several weeks, yet this time she stepped into Daniel and Olivia's home with a calm certainty that had not been there before. The late afternoon sun filtered through the front windows, lighting the living room with a warm golden glow while the scent of roasted vegetables and herbs drifted from the kitchen. Olivia greeted her with the same confident smile, explaining cheerfully that dinner would be ready in a few minutes. Margaret responded with the same warm politeness she had always shown, removing her coat and placing the small container of cornbread on the counter. Daniel appeared from the hallway moments later, offering his mother a gentle hug. Margaret noticed again the careful tension in his posture, but tonight she also noticed something else. When Daniel looked at her, there was a quiet question in his eyes, as if he were waiting to see whether she had understood the message he had sent. Margaret gave him the same reassuring smile she had given him many times when he was young. The dinner table looked as neat as ever, with white plates arranged carefully beside polished silverware. Olivia spoke enthusiastically about how productive the past week had been. She mentioned that they had almost finished organizing the financial paperwork needed for the upcoming refinancing process. She explained that once everything was finalized, the house would have greater financial flexibility for future projects. Daniel nodded quietly while she spoke, though he remained mostly silent. Margaret listened attentively, letting Olivia describe the process in detail. Each explanation confirmed what Margaret had already suspected. The documents she had seen on the desk were not simply early ideas. They were part of a process already moving forward. Margaret asked a few gentle questions about how long the paperwork might take and whether the bank had already reviewed the application. Olivia answered confidently, explaining that several documents would likely be signed soon so the process could move forward without delays. Daniel shifted slightly in his chair during that explanation. Margaret noticed the movement immediately. She waited until Olivia stood to refill the water glasses before turning slightly toward her son. The moment lasted only a few seconds. Daniel's hand rested near hers on the table. Without looking directly at him, Margaret placed her hand gently beside his. Daniel's fingers tightened briefly. 3 small squeezes. The signal once again. This time Margaret responded quietly. Her hand closed around his for a moment, steady and calm, just as his father used to do years ago. Daniel looked at her then, truly looked at her, and for the first time in weeks the tension in his expression softened slightly. When Olivia returned to the table, Margaret continued the conversation as though nothing unusual had happened. She complimented the meal and asked about a new grocery store that had opened nearby. The evening continued peacefully on the surface, yet something important had shifted beneath the quiet conversation. After dinner, Daniel offered again to walk his mother to her car. The evening air outside was cool and calm, and the quiet neighborhood street stretched peacefully under the glow of streetlights. Margaret paused beside the car door and turned toward her son. Daniel looked tired, but relieved at the same time, as though a heavy weight had begun to lift. Margaret spoke gently but clearly. She told him that whenever he felt ready to talk openly, she would be there to listen. She did not accuse anyone, and she did not mention financial documents or refinancing plans. She simply reminded him of something his father had once told him many years ago. A signal only works if someone is there to answer it. Daniel nodded slowly, the tension easing from his shoulders as he understood what she meant. Margaret placed a reassuring hand on his arm before stepping into the car. As she drove away through the quiet streets of the neighborhood, she felt certain about one thing. The signal had never been about solving a problem instantly. It had always been about letting someone know they were not alone. And now Daniel Collins understood that the message he sent had been heard clearly, just as it always had been when he was a child sitting beside his father years ago.